Welcome to our short interview series with leaders in the affordable housing and community development and lots of issues like our guest today, Representative Angelica Rubio, who works on more than just those two issues. You're elected official, you work on a lot of issues simultaneously. My name is Mike Loftin, and I'm a non-resident fellow at the Urban Institute. I'm also the CEO of Homewise. And as Homewise is a New Mexico-based nonprofit that works to increase access to homeownership, both so people can enjoy the benefits of affordable housing over the long term, build wealth, and improve their long-term financial well-being. So, Representative Rubio, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I know you pay attention to a lot of issues, including housing issues. Maybe you could share with us a little bit about what do you think some of the most pressing housing issues are facing New Mexico today?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a significant amount. I hadn't yet become a champion in this is my 6th year in the legislature, and housing it hadn't been a thing for me early on in my career. And it wasn't until the pandemic started 2.5 years ago, that Representative Andrea Romero from Santa Fe, her and I were starting to really have we had concerns that here we were in a pandemic, we were urging people to stay home, and yet there was a lot of people who were not only at risk of losing their shelter even before the pandemic because of just the inequities that existed then, but it was just going to be that much more amplified because people were going to start losing their jobs. People were already facing a lot of income disparities, and so we knew that there was going to be a lot of really a lot of setbacks for a lot of families throughout the state. And so her and I started working on legislation as soon as the pandemic started to try to modernize our housing code here in the state. It's a very complicated issue when it comes to housing, from as far as like developers who are looking to buy and do some good affordable housing, issues with codes and things like that, all the way to homeowners just facing a lot of issues themselves. And so we were trying to tackle a lot of issues in one piece of legislation. And over time, what we realized was that we were just trying to prevent evictions. And so evictions is the piece that we really worked on this last session, where we were trying to extend the length of time that a renter would have to basically take care of their rent before an eviction would actually take place. Unfortunately, we've continuously faced a lot of pushback, particularly from the Senate, who is the chamber that has yet to really hear any of our legislation, despite all of the work and compromises that we've made in the House.
Right, and you've also we were in a crisis, and you know, I think for probably most of us it was our first global pandemic ever, right? So.
Right.
So, you know, we had to manage through that, it sounds like, and there was a lot of good work that happened, like with emergency rental assistance, and I know we worked on emergency mortgage assistance. One thing that struck me during that period, and you know, great instability, is relative to renters, homeowners did a lot better through that because they could get a forbearance on their mortgage. I mean, so even without direct assistance, many of them were able to navigate a system. And there's just, you know, just greater stability in housing. I think what was really, which is it's on my radar now, of like, you know, there's a lot of discussion about the social determinants of health and how housing is, or lack of housing is a really big determinant of poor health.
Right.
And part of that is your housing stable? And so I've never really thought that much about until now, is that, you know, it's not, you know, home ownership does provide a way more stable way to live, where you don't have a landlord evicting you and that kind of stuff. And it's a benefit that we generally don't think of, associate with home ownership. We think about wealth building and that kind of stuff. But just like knowing your family is going to be stable, that's worth a lot.
Yeah.
right?
And it's interesting, and I'm glad that you raised that, because I feel that that was a lot of what Representative Romero and I had to describe, particularly to our colleagues in the legislature, that when a person loses their shelter, it leads to other consequences that
Yeah,
impact the rest of society. When you have a family with young children, they if they get evicted or their home is foreclosed upon, they have to move from a neighborhood that maybe they had already been settled in for quite some time. They have to move from one school to another. They
right.
have to end up in, if they're evicted, they can't, more than likely the only housing they can attain is in a neighborhood that maybe doesn't have the kind of amenities that they had in their other neighborhood. Like, there are just so many different consequences that it doesn't just impact the family itself, it impacts our entire
Right.
society. And that was, I think, part of the persuasion that we had to prov- that we had to do within the legislature, is to describe the multitude in which everyone would be impacted if just one family or one person would be evicted or be
Right.
foreclosed upon.
Yeah. No, and I think your example, people have to change schools for their kids. We know when kids are moving around a lot, and that's why schools
Hmm.
study mobility rates of students. It really negatively impacts educational outcomes. And I don't
Hmm.
think I think the pandemic, one silver lining to it, maybe it did get more of us to start connecting more dots.
Yeah.
Right. So now I know that you worked to pass the bill in the roundhouse that in our legislature that created or increased funding and created a dedicated funding stream for the state housing trust fund. So that's like really exciting, because I think we had to manage through this crisis, and there's still work to be done there. We're not all the way through it, but it's really good that we're looking forward to, like, hey, how do we add to the supply of affordable housing and help more people buy a home and make sure there's rental, on a more proactive long-term basis. The trust fund is going to be helpful for that, right? It gives financial resources to, really go more proactively to solving housing problems. Maybe you could tell us more about your work on that and what your hopes are for that.
Yeah, I mean, I have to give a lot of credit to Senator Nancy Rodriguez. I mean, she has been working in that committee in the interim for years, and now as vice chair of Senate Finance, really through her leadership, she championed that bill out of the Senate and into the House, where Representative Small was able to carry that. The thing is with that trust fund, that a version of it already was in existence. The problem was is that because we have such a um I just lost the word, but in terms of our dependence on oil and gas, I mean, our general fund is always constantly going up and down. And so
Right.
one of the places in which we would when we would deplete any other funds, this was the housing fund. This housing fund was the one that we constantly depleted, and so it was never being replenished. And so part of what the whole purpose of this legislation was is that not only were we wanting to replenish it, but that there would be some recurring funds that would lead to some sustainability in the future. And I think this is the silver lining in which you describe, is that it was through this legislation that legislators, I think, finally recognized that in order for housing and the affordability of housing to be attainable here in the state of New Mexico, we actually need to stop depleting a fund that is
Right.
fundamental to that entire process.
Right. No, I think it's great. It's the biggest positive housing news in the state for a long that we've had in a long time, and I do I appreciate your shout out for Senator Nancy Rodriguez, because she's been a champion in the trenches for affordable housing forever, and
Hmm.
she's been there and she's had tenacity that is just fun, and y'all brought home you brought home the bacon on this one. It's really good, and people are very excited about it.
Yeah, no, that's
So
great news.
yeah, it's really, because the bottom line is, if the state doesn't have money to invest in this, you can't leverage other people's money. You can't leverage private money. You can't leverage federal money. You gotta have an ante to the table, or you can't play. So it's I think of it as
Exactly.
like, so it's really exciting and encouraging. So another issue, I know you're very you've done a lot of work over time on environmental issues and sustainability issues. I know you were chair of the House Transportation Committee, which, full of environmental issues there. Can we get around without getting in the car every single day? It's a big deal. It's a big environmental issue. Maybe, like, one thing that we just, Kelly O'Donnell, who is the director of our Home Wisdom Project, which is kind of our policy kind of think tank at Homewise, is she wrote a paper called Housing Justice Equals Climate Justice. And, one of the things in housing and the built environment is people think a lot about green building and the need to build more energy efficient buildings and reduce our carbon footprint, which is important. What I thought was really interesting in Kelly's paper, she pointed out it's not just how you build the house, it's where you build it, right? Is there walkability? Is there public transportation? Is the only place you can afford to live in Albuquerque, but you work in Santa Fe? So if you got the folks that were commuting every day and those kind of long distances to live closer to their work, you would reduce their carbon footprint by some outrageous percentage. I think it's like 90% from the paper. Transportation is a huge contributor to carbon, right? So tell us about your thoughts on that. And again, it's connecting the dots. We talked about health and the well-being of the family. What about housing and the well-being of the environment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad that she did this study, and I hope more people read it, because that's why I was very excited to chair the Committee on Transportation, because it's not just about transportation, it's also about public works and capital improvements and thinking beyond just personal vehicle use in highways and roads. And I think that's sort of like the fixture in New Mexico, is how are we going to fund the maintenance of roads? And what I have been trying to do since I began my chair role in the legislature for this committee is to try to get folks to think beyond that, and to do so in a way that's intersectional, where housing, there is a connection between everything that we do in our lives, from housing to our commutes to all of that. I'm a bike commuter. I have a cargo bike that I use to get around, that was recently converted into an electric bike. For me to ride around my community, even though Las Cruces is considered a bronze city when it comes to access for those of us who cycle, it's not necessarily the best place to cycle, and so, or to get around, even just sidewalks and walkability, and for folks who are using other forms of transportation. And so the housing piece is critical, because one, we're not fully funding our public transportation system. It's still a cost for many. Routes are still impossible that they're still not done on time. They don't get to a place on time. A lot of our the bus stops are in plain view of the heat. There is no shelter for a lot of these bus stops. And to me, that's concerning, especially in the city of Las Cruces, where we have led to this huge urban sprawl, where we've been developing far to the east of Las Cruces. And so that's where the impacts of commutes have increased, where you have folks living on the east side of Las Cruces, out in the East Mesa, and then having to drive into town in the city, where we've divested, in my opinion, traditional neighborhoods that have been here for a really long time. And so I think her study really brings to the forefront of how so much of all of that we're doing, all of this city planning that has been done in the past, it's always been done to prioritize a personal vehicle. And what I believe that we should be doing is that we should not be centering personal vehicle use. We should be centering people and their way of life. And that means whether they walk or they cycle or they use a public transportation, a bus to get to and from their jobs, that we need to actually be investing in those things first. And then we can talk about building big parking lots somewhere else. But for that for me is not my priority. For me, it's housing and how we make that affordable for all people.
Right. When you mentioned the whole problem of sprawl, and this is something that is like it's in my life all the time. This sprawl dynamic where, because we build affordable housing and affordable homes at Homewise, and and we really like infill because you're using existing infrastructure. You're increasing density and proximity, so people can walk to a store. They can walk. Their kids can walk to a park. You don't have to take them in a car every day. Lately we've been very focused on the intersection, or how accessible our projects are for bike trails. Because like in Santa Fe, you can get on the river trail and you're in 10, 15 minutes, you're downtown and you didn't cross the street because the trail goes under bridges, right? And I ride my bike. I use that sometimes to get to work, and it's really pleasant. It's a great way to start the day. It's harder.
And for us, it's the ditches
that you got to get across.
Yeah, no, but for us, it's the ditches. I mean, if you're not familiar with the ditches in the city of Las Cruces, then you're going to be riding these main street roads that are so hard to cross. But for those of us who ride on an ongoing basis, I mean, we know those little shortcuts so that we don't have to actually endure these lights that don't yet recognize bikes.
Interesting. So, I don't know Las Cruces well, but the thing is, so it's like there's a way to do this that's better and more responsible for the environment. It's better for the city. It's better for our health because we can walk places that and it's really hard to do because when you're doing infill, there's neighbors who that's where they take their dog to use the bathroom. They don't want it to change.
Yeah.
And so they want that big. And so there's almost always a fight on any kind of infill thing. But then you get some of the big home builders, they go out farther out, right? And they go way out, 5 miles out of town. There are no neighbors. We call it greenfield development, and there is no opposite. So it's easier. It's a path of least resistance. And it seems like our system, the way we do land use decisions, favors sprawl and disincentivizes the kind of development that would reduce our carbon footprint, would give us the kind of cities, mixed use neighborhoods that everybody says they want.
Right.
But I don't want to give up the vacant lot where I take my dog to use the bathroom in order to have that. What can the state do? Is the state talks about these kinds of issues? There's things that we can do to make that, to create more responsible development.
Yeah, I was having this conversation with someone earlier this week about it, because I think there's sort of these catch-22s that we find ourselves in here in New Mexico, where we want to be able to build and develop some reasonable housing opportunities, say in a more centralized location. But like you mentioned, we deal a lot with NIMBYs and in our communities. And for folks who are listening, a NIMBY, if you're not familiar, it's not in my backyard. Those are folks that have existed in our society for a very long time. I think part of that is one, we have to address it. We have to be able to, especially if there's opportunities for state level policymakers who are working alongside city officials, particularly planners, so that we're actually doing. I mean, I'm a community organizer by trade, so like for me to be able to talk to neighborhoods and folks who live in these areas, to be able to do that kind of public outreach and say, look, these are the reasons why these issues exist. This is what our plans are, and like, how do we involve communities so that they're part of the process, instead of state and local officials saying this is what we're going to do. And I feel like there's opportunities for communities to come together when we're talking about these types of issues, and I think we should be getting better at that.
Right. No, definitely. And I think one thing I was thinking is that we need to get development discussions and land use discussions into what's our vision for the future, for our city, for the broader community. What do we really want? Don't we want walkability? Don't we want not have to get in the car every day? Don't we want mixed use? People say, and they love those kinds of neighborhoods, but we don't have a way to do it well yet. And so what happens is everything's around this specific proposal. I'm against, somebody's for it. Some people who are most affected about it, they're going to lose a view or something. They're the most against it, and it kind of stays there without what's the civic discourse,
right,
for the greater good and for the whole. And like, I think we
Yeah.
just need to figure out how to do that better as
Yeah.
communities.
I have this vision as chair of this transportation committee. One, I want to change the name of it. If I remain as chair of this committee, I don't want it to be called transportation, public works, and capital improvements. I think it has to be more holistic in terms of moving us away from this idea of just personal vehicle use and roads, which is the main focus, because I think it's hard for folks to reimagine something different. Like, if I had I want people to see where could we be in 10 to 25 years, creating this multi-generational plan that is not only that looks like New Mexico and it's created by New Mexicans, but that, like, I want people to have an opportunity to sort of think about and dream about something different. And I feel like we don't allow our communities to do that, because everyone is just kind of like, I mean, everyone's hustling, everyone's trying to make ends meet every single
Right.
day. The thought of them having to think about where we're going to be in 15 and 20 years is really hard for people to do when they don't even know if they're going to have food on the table tomorrow. And so I feel like it's our responsibility as leaders that we are touching base with our communities, that we are in the trenches and understanding what's happening on the ground, so that when we are in Santa Fe, that we're actually addressing those issues. And unfortunately, I don't necessarily see that from a lot of legislators. I think that many of them are only addressing sort of the big business side of things. How do we build economic development without realizing that, well, if we're actually addressing things from the root causes, we can actually address everything else as well.
No, that's great, and I think that's a good note to end on. It's the work you're doing is very exciting. Lots of people are doing. I'm very hopeful for the future of New Mexico and the kind of leadership that we have working like yourself that's working on this issue. So I really appreciate having this conversation and you sharing your experience and knowledge. And I love the fact that you ride your bike all the way from Las Cruces to Santa Fe. It's like really cool. So
Yeah,
anyway,
well, considering the heat that we've had, the streak of heat that we've had this week, I don't mind the idea of riding up to Santa Fe in the cold come January. I'm actually really looking forward to that.
That'll be a nice break. So
Yeah,
anyway, thank you so much for your time. This is a great conversation, and thank you so much for all the hard work you do for our state.
for sure. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it.